Hi everyone, I'm David Cochran and this is Power and Politics. Ontario hospitals are calling for action. They want a lockdown in red zones amid record numbers of new COVID infections and hospitalizations.
I think we're at a point where we need to consider every option to stop and slow this down.
Everything's on the table, and we always take the advice from the medical experts.
As the Premier said, all things are on the table, and the Minister of Health has said the same thing.
Well, 5 of those people who died in the past 4 days were in my ICU, and they died of COVID-19, and their families weren't there with them.
Premier Doug Ford says he's listening to the advice of medical experts. So why isn't he taking stronger action? Will people follow the rules and avoid gatherings, or will the holiday season make the situation worse? Ontario's doctors are recommending schools be closed for longer if the virus continues to spread. How likely is it that kids will be learning online in January? We're going to tackle all of that with our primetime panel. Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister. And to kick off the conversation, epidemiologist Raywat Deonandan. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, David.
Professor Deonandan, I want to start with you. And first of all, let me say that your work from home setup looks better than my work from work setup. The high cases, are these a signal that the current restrictions just aren't working?
I knew you would ask that question. It's unclear. I think they were working a couple of weeks ago when the reproduction number dropped below 1 for a couple of days, but they've crept up again, of course. The problem is that it's confounded with the holiday season, and people, I think, are starting their shopping and their socialization. So the lockdowns, the restrictions are always meant to disincentivize human behavior. If they're not disincentivizing that behavior, then they have failed. However, it's hard to say what would have happened had we not put in place those restrictions.
What's the goal now? I mean, we go back to the first wave. We all talked about flattening the curve so the hospital system would not be overwhelmed. And now here we are in the second wave with those same warnings being uttered, though with a greater level of urgency, it seems. So when you look at the situation in Ontario and the approach that they're taking, what would you say the province's goal is at the moment?
That is a heavy question. Now that we have a vaccine, the goal might be to prevent all vaccine-preventable deaths, which is not a bad goal to have. But I think the primary goal is still do not overwhelm the healthcare system. In Ontario, we have, 2,100 ICU beds. About 1,700 or more are filled right now. 260 or more of those are COVID. It sounds like we have buffer there, but we don't, because the rate-limiting step is actually healthcare workers, doctors and nurses and so forth. So that's being overwhelmed right now. And so we have the real risk of having to cancel surgeries and having downstream negative medical consequences happen. So we're back to square one in many ways.
So James, Premier Doug Ford said today that everything is on the table. He said he wouldn't hesitate. Some of his critics have argued that he has been hesitating. I mean, do you think it's inevitable that we're going to see more and stricter lockdowns?
Well, conceivably. I mean, the announcement, the great announcement of these vaccines coming online and the first shots going into people's shoulders is all very good news. But of course, it does create a sort of a parallel paradox, which is people then start perhaps relaxing and thinking that the end is nigh. And, all the premiers and the prime minister talking about light at the end of the tunnel, we're turning the corner, everything is great. We have to be careful, frankly, that we don't get into that sort of Trumpian language in the summer of 2020, where he said everything was fine, and then people sort of broke out and started partying in the summer of 2020, and we see what the consequences of that were. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. But I think, as was just mentioned, the knock-on effects of this and the consequences of it, it's not just overwhelmed ICUs and emergency rooms and hospitals and the stress that has. Shachi and I are both members are on the board of the Canadian Cancer Society, and we had a presentation at our board meeting a couple of weeks ago from Ontario Health and their chief cancer specialist, where he pointed out that for every 4 weeks in delay in cancer treatment, is an increase in about 4 to 6% in the mortality of all cancers. So, and 1 in 4 Canadians will die of cancer. 45% of Canadians will get cancer at some point in our lives. All men at some point will get prostate cancer if you just have to live long enough. So just in that one siloed example of cancer alone, the effects of this in terms of mortality and the threat to the health and safety of Ontarians is dramatic.
Shachi, there is light at the end of the tunnel, but it's still a very long and a very dark tunnel. And the country now has more than 100 Canadians dying every single day over the past week or so from this. I mean, the lesson of the first wave was kind of like the quicker you act, the better results you got, it seems. But other premiers, they've been reluctant to introduce harsher restrictions. They've all eventually been forced to do that. Is it simply a matter of time for that to happen here in Ontario?
Possibly, but at some point as well, restrictions stop working if you have lost the population in terms of their willingness to follow the restrictions. So, James and I are in BC. You're not supposed to be traveling out of your community. You're not supposed to be visiting people. You're supposed to be avoiding all of those things. But to the good doctor's earlier point, we're running into the most social time of year, 10 months into a pandemic, that have tested people, tested their ability to see friends and family in the worst way, and now we're starting to hear almost parallel communications from their public health officials. One, that yes, we are turning the corner, the vaccines are indeed here, but two, it's still really scary out there and you need to keep locked down. Well, guess what? Even the most compliant, well-intentioned, responsible citizens are saying, to hell with this. We're done with it to an extent. And so that is why you see people out shopping. It is why 30% of Canadians still say they plan to see friends and family in a safer way, in a more socially distant way, but they still intend to see people over the holidays. And at some point, I don't think that is a matter of people being bad. I think it is a matter of people feeling fatigued and looking for a little bit of normalcy. And so really the cajole from politicians, from public health experts at this stage may not be, oh, naughty, naughty, more restrictions coming. It may simply be, look, this is not forever. There is an end to this, but the end is not now. And don't let all of the other good news disabuse you of that. These are really, really tough times for people.
Yeah, and the reality too, Shachi, is that a lot of the outbreaks have been in large-scale industrial sites where people often make hourly wages, don't have robust sick leave, and simply can't stay home, right? They have to go to work because it's a matter of economic survival for them.
Right, and frontline health officials and frontline workers, if you're a driver, if you are working in food prep, or if you are working in a long-term care facility, as you say, a lot of these people don't have choices, and they are choosing ultimately to feed their families and actually to be able to buy Christmas presents for their families.
Professor, I want to play a clip from Dr. Michael Warner. He's a director of critical care at Toronto Hospital. He spoke to my colleague Natasha Fatah earlier today, and he's a very blunt talker throughout this entire thing, but he says the province needs to act now. Just listen to this.
When I listened to Dr. Williams speak today, and clearly he's made advice to the Premier, but again and again, he won't tell us what that advice is. And when I have a patient, I tell them what the diagnosis is right away, and I don't wait 3 days to implement the treatment. And that's what's going to happen. The Premier is going to announce something like a GTHA lockdown, perhaps for implementation on Monday. Those days that will pass will lead to lives lost, and enough is enough.
So, Professor, how important is it that Ontarians and Canadians writ large actually know what their chief medical officers who are driving this response in some places are advising premiers to do? And how critical is the timing in implementing these new measures if they're going to come?
I keep going back to a paper written in 2007 that talked about the lessons learned from SARS-1. And number one amongst those lessons was transparency from our leaders. We need to be transparent about what the plans are and what we do and don't know. So if the plan is to implement some restrictions in a couple of days, let's hear it right now. And the second part of this is the mathematics of this says that when exponential growth is on the table, as it is, it's better to act sooner rather than later. So if you're going to do it, let's do it now.
So should Dr. Williams be telling us what his advice to the Premier and the Cabinet is?
Yeah, I think so. I think at this point, there's so much of a crisis in mistrust of government, mistrust of science and all that stuff, that the only way forward is complete transparency and openness with the public. There is no other way forward.
James and Shachi, I want to get you to react to this. It's another clip from Dr. Warner that I want to play. He works in critical care, and he's seen a lot of patients die over the past little while. I think 4 or 5, he said, in the past week, patients he cared for, and he described what it was like when a patient dies from COVID. Listen to this.
Let me paint a picture. So you're in a room, perhaps with a nurse, hopefully with a nurse holding your hand. You might be lying on your belly because that's the only way that you can breathe. If we have time to get the iPad ready, we organize a Zoom call with your family. They're crying on the Zoom call as you take your last breath. And you're alone. You're with us, but you're not with the people who know you. And that is played out every day in ICUs across the world, but also in Ontario and Canada.
If the current messaging isn't working, does the messaging around this need to be as blunt as what Dr. Warner was just describing for people to get the message on the consequences here? James?
Well, the testimony is impactful, powerful, and we hear it again and again. And I think as we do move forward in the pivot from where we are now towards vaccination, I think all those anti-vaxxers and those people out there who have hesitations about this need to be stared down with this kind of testimony and evidence about what it really is like and what it really is that we're combating. I think maybe I disagree with the comments a moment ago about the chief medical health officer coming out and just sort of giving their opinion. We elect leaders and we have straight lines of accountability to the premier's office and then all of our premiers, and they make the decision. And they are struggling with this because there's no formula about this that is clear, simple, and perfect. They have to be guided, of course, by the medical health officers and their advice and guided by that. But they also have an opportunity and a responsibility to try to counterbalance that and inject that with some other competing forces like the business community, small business community, families that are struggling, and so on. So it's not an easy task. Medical science has to lead the way, of course, but these competing interests are what keep Doug Ford up at night for sure. And Jason Kenney spoke about that and conceded about some of the mistakes that he's made in Alberta and trying to get this balance right, because there's no perfect playbook. It's an assortment of bad and conflicting decisions that have to be tried to reconcile.
Okay, Shachi, final thoughts from you, and then we're going to take a quick break.
Well, I mean, just listening personally, I almost got a lump in my throat listening to that. But, so, hey, that clip is a very good example of how it can be explained that this happens to real people. This could happen to your family member. You really don't want this to happen to your family member. But at the same time, it can't just always be the worst case scenario. I think Canadians, people, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to anything that requires change behavior, the case also needs to be made where when you do this, you see success on that. And I think we do at this stage need to pivot to a message that is a little bit more demonstrative of when people are following the rules or doing their part or taking preventative measures, it actually is having an impact. And hopefully it is having an impact on keeping those cases low. People need to hear about the successes in order to stay motivated.
Okay, we're going to have to take a quick break. Epidemiologist Raywat Deonandan, thank you so much for joining us. Your insights were valuable. Shachi and James will be back after the break. We'll look at how the vaccine rollout is going across Canada. Stay with us.